Marin had not planned to destroy her own reputation before breakfast, but life, as she had learned working in the palace archives for the past 6 years, rarely consulted her about its plans. She was standing in the east corridor of the royal wing, blinking against the pale gray light of dawn, with a stack of misfiled land treaties clutched to her chest and ink stains on both hands. Her hair had come loose from its braids sometime around midnight, and now hung in tangled waves around her face. Her dress was wrinkled from sleeping hunched over a desk. She looked, by any reasonable assessment, like a woman who had spent the night doing something she should not have been doing. The door at the far end of the corridor opened, and the Alpha King walked through it. Marin froze. King Theron Ashvane was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in his chambers, behind the heavy oak doors she had been carefully avoiding all night while she worked in the records vault 3 rooms down. But here he was, stepping through the service entrance that led to the palace grounds, and he looked worse than she did. His dark hair was damp with sweat. His shirt was untucked, the laces at his throat pulled open. There was dirt on his boots and a scratch across his jaw that had not been there yesterday. His breathing was rough, controlled but deliberate, like a man forcing himself to slow down. He saw her and stopped dead. For one terrible, suspended moment, they stared at each other. Marin's brain, still half asleep and running on cold tea and panic, produced exactly one coherent thought. I should not be seeing this. Whatever the king had been doing tonight, wherever he had not intended anyone to witness his return. That much was written plainly across his face in the half-second before his expression locked down into something hard and unreadable. Marin opened her mouth to say something, an apology, an explanation, a prayer for the floor to open and swallow her whole. She never got the chance. Footsteps echoed from the main staircase, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Voices followed, low and clipped, and Marin recognized one of them immediately. Lord Haldrick, the king's senior counselor. The man whose gaze could curdle milk at 20 paces and whose political instincts were legendary. Theron's head turned sharply toward the sound. Something flickered across his face. Not fear. Something colder. Calculation. Stay exactly where you are, he said to her. His voice was low and rough, and left absolutely no room for discussion. Marin stayed. The delegation rounded the corner. Lord Haldrick led, flanked by 2 lesser counselors and a palace guard. They were dressed for the day already, immaculate and sharp-eyed, and they had clearly come looking for the king. Haldrick's gaze swept the corridor. It found Theron first, noting the disheveled state with barely concealed interest. Then it found Marin. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. The king, undone and breathing hard. A young woman, flushed and rumpled, standing in the corridor outside his private rooms at dawn, her hair down, her dress creased. Ink on her fingers that could easily be mistaken for something else in this light. Haldrick's eyebrows rose. One of the counselors behind him made a small, choked sound. Your Majesty, Haldrick said smoothly, we missed you at the late council session. I trust you were occupied. The pause before that last word carried the weight of an entire scandal. Marin's stomach dropped through the floor. She looked at the king, waiting for him to correct the assumption. Waiting for him to say something like, this woman is my archivist. She was working in the records vault, and this is not what it looks like. Theron said nothing. He looked at Haldrick with an expression of supreme indifference, as though being caught in a corridor with a disheveled woman at dawn was beneath his concern. Then he turned to Marin, and for one fleeting instant she caught it. A flash of regret in his gaze, buried almost before it surfaced. An apology, maybe, or a warning. You may go, the king said to her. His tone was dismissive, practiced. Marin clutched her land treaties like a shield and walked past the delegation on legs that did not feel entirely solid. She could feel their stares boring into her back. The story was already taking shape in their minds, growing legs, preparing to sprint through every corridor and kitchen and council chamber in the palace. She made it around the corner before the trembling started. By mid-morning, the whisper had reached the archives. By noon, it had reached the kitchens. By evening, every soul in the palace believed that Marin Lockwood, junior archivist and the most invisible woman in the kingdom, had spent the night in the Alpha King's bed. She was sitting at her desk in the archives, pretending to catalog border disputes from 30 years ago, when the King's beta appeared in her doorway. Soren Falk was a tall, lean man with an unsettling ability to appear from nowhere and a face that gave away absolutely nothing. "Miss Lockwood," he said. A word. Marin followed him into the corridor, her pulse hammering. "Whatever you think happened this morning," she started. "What I think happened," Soren interrupted calmly, "is irrelevant. What matters is what the court believes happened, and the court believes you spent the night with the king." "But I did not." "No," Soren agreed. "You did not." A silence stretched between them that felt far too knowing. "The king has a request," Soren continued. "You will not correct the assumption. You will not deny the rumor. You will not discuss the circumstances of this morning with anyone." Marin stared at him. "You want me to let the entire palace believe I am the king's mistress? I want you to consider that the alternative would raise questions His Majesty cannot answer." The implication settled over her like cold water. Whatever Theron had been doing last night, it was something he would rather be accused of betting a commoner than reveal. "And if I refuse?" Marin asked. Soren studied her for a moment. "Then the king would have to explain where he actually was, and people who are far more dangerous than Lord Haldrick would start asking questions that could destabilize this court." Marin swallowed hard. "His Majesty requests your presence this evening," Soren added. "In his chambers. We need to discuss the terms of the arrangement." The word arrangement landed like a stone in her gut. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him this was unfair and absurd, and that her reputation was not a bargaining chip. But the look in Soren's eyes told her this was not a negotiation. This was damage control for something much bigger than her pride. "Fine," Marin said, her voice small and furious. "But I want it on record that this is not my choice." "Noted," Soren replied, without a trace of sympathy. That night, Marin dreamed she was standing before the entire court in her nightgown, while a herald announced her official title. Marin Lockwood, junior archivist and royal bedwarmer. She woke up in a cold sweat, her hands fisted in the sheets, and seriously considered fleeing the kingdom entirely. Instead, she got dressed and reported to the king's chambers. The door was already open when she arrived. Soren stood inside, waiting, and gestured her toward a chair near the window. The king's chambers were enormous. Weapons mounted on the walls, a massive desk buried under correspondence and maps, bookshelves lining one wall from floor to ceiling, and the bed. Marin refused to look at the bed. Theron entered through a side door a moment later, and the air in the room changed immediately. He was dressed properly now, dark jacket buttoned to the throat, not a hair out of place, every inch the controlled, unreachable monarch. Nothing like the wild, breathless figure she had seen at dawn. He sat behind his desk and looked at her the way one might examine a problem that required solving. "Miss Lockwood," he said, "I understand this situation is not ideal." "Not ideal is a generous description, Your Majesty," Marin replied before she could stop herself. His gaze sharpened. Not with anger, with surprise. Marin got the impression that people did not often talk back to him. "Nevertheless," he continued, "the alternative is worse. Counselor Haldrick has been watching my movements for months. He suspects something, and what he suspects is far more dangerous than a scandal involving a court archivist." Marin flinched at the dismissal buried in those words. A court archivist. Just a convenient cover story. "What were you actually doing last night?" she asked. "That is not your concern." "It became my concern the moment the court decided I was warming your bed." Silence. Soren, standing by the door, looked like he was trying very hard not to react. Theron leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You will be seen entering and leaving my chambers at regular intervals," he said, ignoring her question entirely. "You will attend certain court functions at my side. You will say nothing that contradicts the assumption. In return, you will be compensated, your position in the archives will be secured, and you will have my personal protection." "Your protection from what?" Marin asked. "From the scandal you created?" "From anyone who might target you because of your perceived closeness to the crown." That stopped her cold. She had not considered that. Being the king's rumored lover did not just mean whispers and sidelong glances. It meant becoming a target for anyone who wanted leverage against him. "How long?" she asked. "Until I determine it is safe to end the arrangement." "That is not an answer. It is the only one I have." Marin looked at Soren, hoping for something, anything, a sympathetic glance, a reassuring nod. The beta's face was stone. She turned back to the king and tried to ignore the way her pulse jumped when his gray eyes met hers. He was absurdly handsome up close. It was deeply unfair. "Fine," she said, "but I have conditions." Both men looked at her with expressions suggesting that no one had ever presented the Alpha King with conditions before. "I am not sleeping in this room," Marin said firmly. "I will arrive. I will sit in that chair." She pointed at the armchair near the fireplace. "I will bring my work, and I will leave before dawn. That is the extent of my performance." Theron regarded her for a long moment. "Acceptable. And I want access to the restricted vault whenever I need it, after hours, without having to file 3 separate permission forms." His mouth twitched. "Agreed. And better candles in the archives. The ones we have now are an insult." His jaw tightened, but it was not anger. The ghost of amusement tugged at the corner of his mouth before he smothered it. "I will have it arranged." "Then we have a deal," Marin said, standing on legs that wanted to shake. She smoothed her skirt with deliberate calm. "I will begin my performance this evening." She turned and walked to the door with as much dignity as she could assemble. She made it 3 steps into the corridor before her composure cracked, and she sagged against the wall, pressing both hands over her racing heart. Behind her, through the barely open door, she heard Soren speak. "She negotiated better candles out of you." The king did not respond. "No one has ever negotiated anything out of you," Soren added. "Get out," Theron said. Marin pushed off the wall and fled before either of them could catch her smiling. The arrangement began that same evening, and it was immediately, spectacularly awkward. Marin arrived at the king's chambers with an armful of archive ledgers, a fresh pot of ink, and the grim determination of a woman marching to her own social execution. The guard at the door gave her a look that managed to be both respectful and deeply knowing. She wanted to set his eyebrows on fire. Inside, Theron was working at his desk. He did not look up when she entered. He did not acknowledge her at all. She crossed to the armchair by the fire, sat down, arranged her materials on the small table beside it, and opened the first ledger. Silence settled over the room like dust. Marin read, or tried to. The words blurred in front of her because she could not stop being aware of him. The scratch of his pen, the occasional rustle of paper, the way the firelight caught the sharp line of his jaw when he turned his head. She had never been this close to him for this long, and the sheer physical reality of him was overwhelming. He was larger than she had appreciated from a distance. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the window behind him, and when he shifted in his chair, she could see the controlled power in the movement. This was a man who had led armies, who had ended a war with violence and will. and she was sitting in his chambers pretending to be his lover while cataloging grain tariffs from 2 decades ago. The absurdity of it threatened to choke her. An hour passed. Then, another. Marin's eyes were starting to glaze over the ledger when she heard it, a sharp intake of breath from across the room. She looked up. Theron's pen had stopped. His hand was gripping the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. His eyes were fixed on the window, and there was something in them that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Not pain. Something wilder. Something barely contained. "Your Majesty?" she said quietly. He didn't respond. His breathing had changed, deepening into something rough and uneven. His other hand came up to grip the desk as well, and she watched the wood creak under the pressure. "Your Majesty, are you all right?" His head snapped toward her, and for one terrifying heartbeat, his eyes were not entirely his. The gray had darkened to something almost black, and there was a feral edge to his gaze that pinned her to the chair like a physical force. Then he blinked, and it was gone. He released the desk and stood, turning away from her in one sharp movement. "Leave," he said. His voice was rough and strained. Marin did not move. "What just happened?" "I said leave." He braced both hands on the windowsill, his back to her, his shoulders heaving. She gathered her things with shaking hands and walked to the door. She paused with her fingers on the handle and looked back at him. He was silhouetted against the window, rigid and trembling. And in that moment, he did not look like a king. He looked like a man holding himself together by the thinnest possible thread. Marin left. But she did not sleep that night. She returned the next evening because that was the arrangement. And the evening after that. And the one after that. Theron never mentioned what had happened by the window. He never acknowledged the moment his eyes had changed, or the way he had gripped the desk like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the ground. He worked. She worked. They existed in the same room with the careful, deliberate distance of two people pretending the air between them was not charged with something neither of them would name. But Marin was an archivist. Observation was her profession. And she began to notice things. The scratches on his hands that appeared every few mornings, thin and precise, like claw marks from the inside. The way his attention would fracture without warning during their evenings together, his pen going still, his gaze drifting toward the window with that same barely contained wildness. How some nights he would dismiss her early, his voice clipped and urgent, and when she passed the guard station on her way back to her quarters, the night patrol would already be redirected away from the eastern grounds. He was going out. Every night, or nearly every night, after she left. And coming back before dawn looking like he had been through a war with himself. She asked Soren once, casually, whether the king was sleeping well. The beta had given her a look that could have frozen a river. "The king's health is not your concern, Miss Lockwood." "Everything about the king is apparently my concern," Marin replied. "The entire palace believes I am responsible for his well-being in very specific ways." Soren's jaw tightened. "Then you will understand why discretion is paramount." He walked away before she could press further. The court, meanwhile, had fully absorbed the fiction. Marin could not walk through the palace without feeling the weight of it. The servants watched her with a mixture of fascination and pity. The nobles watched her with something colder. She caught fragments of conversation that stopped the moment she entered a room. "Did you see her dress? She cannot possibly think that is appropriate for someone in her position." "Her position being on her back in the royal chambers, you mean?" Marin kept her head down and her expression neutral, and told herself it did not matter. She was invisible before this. She had spent her entire life being invisible. Being seen for the wrong reasons was somehow worse, but she would survive it because surviving things was what she did. On the 5th evening, she arrived to find the fire already lit and a second chair pulled closer to the hearth. A small table sat between the chairs with a tea service on it. 2 cups. Marin stared at it. "I noticed you prefer to work near the fire," Theron said from behind his desk without looking up. "I do," Marin managed, something warm and inconvenient stirring in her chest. She poured herself tea and settled into the new chair, which was significantly more comfortable than the old one. She did not comment on this because she suspected that commenting would make him take it away. That night, for the first time, they talked. Not about the arrangement, not about politics or court dynamics or the elaborate lie they were maintaining. Theron asked what she was working on, and Marin, surprised enough to answer honestly, told him about the border dispute records she was reorganizing. How the previous archivist had misfiled 3 decades of territorial agreements, and she had spent 2 years untangling the mess. 3 decades, Theron repeated. One man's incompetence created 2 years of work for you? Closer to 3 years, actually. He also spilled wine on the heroic Treaty of Succession. I had to reconstruct portions of it from secondary sources. That treaty determines the inheritance rights of 4 noble houses. I am aware, Marin said. It was a very stressful 6 months. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt the full weight of his attention like a hand pressing against her sternum. You reconstructed a foundational legal document from secondary sources. At your age. I was not aware there was a minimum age requirement for competence, Marin replied. The corner of his mouth lifted. Just barely. Just enough for her to notice. Then he looked back at his papers and the moment passed, but something in the room had shifted. A door cracked open that could not be fully closed again. Over the next several evenings, the conversations grew longer. She learned that he read military history before bed, that he despised formal banquets, and that he could name every mountain pass on the northern border from memory. He learned that she had grown up in the palace orphanage, that the old archivist had taken her on as an apprentice when she was 12, because she was the only child who could sit still long enough to copy a full page of text, and that she was terrified of horses. Horses, he said, as though she had confessed to being afraid of pillows. They are enormous and unpredictable, and they look at you with those eyes that suggest they are always one decision away from violence. You have just described most of my counsel, Theron said. Marin laughed before she could catch herself. It came out bright and sudden in the quiet room, and Theron looked at her with an expression she could not read. Something startled and open that vanished before she could name it. She stopped laughing. They stared at each other across the firelit space. I should go, Marin said, suddenly very aware of how late it was and how close the chairs had ended up. Yes, he agreed, but did not move to dismiss her. She gathered her things. At the door, she paused. The scratches on your hands, she said softly. They are getting worse. Theron went very still. Whatever is happening to you, Marin continued, not turning around, I hope you know you do not have to manage it alone. She left before he could respond. In the corridor, she pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall and breathed. Her hand was trembling. 3 nights later, she woke to the sound of something breaking. She had fallen asleep in the armchair again. It kept happening. The fire was warm, the chair was comfortable, and the quiet rhythm of Theron's pen had become, against all reason, soothing. She always meant to stay awake, and she always failed. But this sound was not soothing. It was the sharp crack of wood splintering, followed by a low, guttural sound that raised every hair on her body. Marin's eyes flew open. The desk was cracked down the middle. Theron was on his feet, his back to her, his hands clenched at his sides. His shoulders were shaking. The sound coming from his throat was not a groan and not a growl, but something between the two. Something that belonged to an animal more than a man. He turned his head slightly, and she saw the veins standing out on his neck. saw the way his nails had lengthened, thickening into something that was no longer entirely human. He was shifting, or trying not to. Every muscle in his body was locked in a war between the man and the wolf was winning. Theron, Marin whispered. She had never used his name before. His whole body jerked at the sound. His head swung toward her, and those eyes, black and wild and barely recognizing her, locked onto her face. She should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to run. Instead, Marin stood up from the chair and crossed the room. Raw, dangerous energy poured off him in waves, thickening the air between them. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to vibrate with it. Her wolf, quiet and unremarkable her entire life, stirred beneath her skin for the first time, pressing forward instead of shrinking back. She reached him and took his hand. His fingers were burning hot and not quite the right shape. She held on anyway. She held on, and she started talking. She told him about the Heroic Treaty, about the wine stain that had obliterated 3 critical clauses, about how she had spent 4 months tracking down a copy of the original draft in a monastery archive 200 miles away, only to discover that the monks had been using it as a placemat. It was the most boring, mundane, utterly undramatic thing she could think of. And word by word, sentence by sentence, she watched the wildness recede from his eyes, watched his fingers return to their proper shape around hers, watched his breathing slow from ragged gasps to something deep and shaking but human. When it was over, he sank to his knees on the floor, still gripping her hand, his forehead pressed against her wrist. His whole body was trembling. Marin knelt beside him. She did not let go. "How long?" she asked quietly. He did not answer for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was wrecked. "Since the war. Almost a year." "Does Soren know?" "Soren knows." "Does anyone else?" "No. And they cannot." He lifted his head. His eyes were gray again, human again, but full of something that made her chest ache. "If the court discovers that their king is losing control of his wolf, I will be challenged. And I do not know if I can win." The confession hung in the air between them. The most powerful man in the kingdom, on his knees, telling her he was falling apart. "You pulled me back," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you pull me back?" "I talked about wine stains on old treaties," Marin said. He stared at her. Then he made a sound that might have been a laugh if it were not so close to breaking. Marin reached up and carefully, giving him every chance to pull away, brushed the damp hair from his forehead. He closed his eyes at the contact, leaning into her touch with a surrender that made her heart clench. "We should tell Petra," Marin said. "The head healer. She might be able to help." "No." "Theron, no one else can know." "Then let me help. Please, I am already here every night. Let me stay until this passes." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and what she saw in his gaze was not the king, and not the wolf, but something stripped bare and terrified and desperately, painfully hopeful. "It will not pass," he said. "Then let me stay anyway." He held her gaze for a long, trembling moment. Then he nodded once. Marin did not leave that night. She sat beside him on the floor with her back against the ruined desk and held his hand while the fire burned low. His grip was tight enough to bruise, and she did not pull away. Sometime before dawn, his breathing changed. The tension drained from his body in slow degrees, and his head tipped sideways until it rested against her shoulder. His fingers loosened around hers but did not let go. He was asleep. Marin sat perfectly still, barely breathing, staring at the cracked desk and the dying fire and the king sleeping on her shoulder. Her heart was doing something complicated and terrifying and irreversible in her chest, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was in very serious trouble. In the morning, Soren found them. He stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds without speaking, his gaze moving from the destroyed desk to the sleeping king to Marin's exhausted face. He slept, Soren said. It was not a question. Marin nodded. The beta's expression did not change, but his shoulders dropped a fraction. The closest thing to relief she had ever seen on his face. Petra will want to examine him, Marin said quietly. He will refuse. Then do not give him the choice. Soren looked at her with a new kind of attention, assessing and recalibrating. Then he nodded. I will arrange it. Petra arrived within the hour. She was a compact woman with silver-streaked hair and hands that moved with the careful precision of someone who had been healing for longer than Marin had been alive. She examined the king with brisk efficiency, while he sat rigid and furious in his chair, radiating displeasure at everyone in the room. When she was finished, Petra drew Marin aside while Soren distracted the king with council business. How bad is it? Marin asked. Petra's expression was grave. Whatever you did last night was the first time anything has slowed the progression in months. Marin's stomach dropped. The progression? The severing between his human mind and his wolf. It has been accelerating. The episodes are getting closer together and lasting longer. Petra paused, her sharp eyes fixed on Marin's face. If this keeps going at its current pace, he will lose himself entirely within a few months. And when an alpha king goes feral... She trailed off. What happens? Marin pressed, though she was not sure she wanted the answer. Petra looked at her steadily. They put him down. That is what happens. The words hit Marin like a blow to the chest. She turned to look through the doorway at Theron, who was listening to Soren with his jaw set and his fingers tapping an impatient rhythm against the arm of his chair. Alive, stubborn, infuriating, and dying by inches every single night. Marin did not tell Theron what Petra had said. She wanted to. The words sat behind her teeth every evening when she arrived at his chambers, heavy and urgent. But she had seen how he reacted to any suggestion that he was vulnerable, and she knew that telling him he was running out of time would only make him push harder. Push her away. So instead, she simply stopped leaving. The arrangement had always required her to be seen entering and exiting the king's rooms. Now she entered and did not exit. She brought a blanket from her own quarters and claimed the armchair by the fire as her permanent post. When Theron pointed out that this exceeded the terms of their agreement, she told him she was behind on her cataloging work, and the light in his chambers was better than the archives. The light in my chambers is identical to every other room on this floor, he said. Then perhaps it is the company, Marin replied, without looking up from her ledger. He did not argue further. She suspected he was too tired to fight her on it, and that suspicion hurt more than she expected. The nights found their rhythm. She worked by the fire while he worked at his new desk, the replacement having arrived within a day. No questions asked. They talked in the spaces between tasks, their conversations growing longer and more honest as the evenings stretched on. He told her about the war. Not the politics of it, not the strategy, but the quieter things. The sound of rain on canvas tents, the way his soldiers sang around the fires at night, low and rough and off-key, and how he had found it unbearable to listen to and unbearable to stop. How the silence after the final battle had been worse than any of the noise before it. We won, he said one night, staring at the flames. And it did not feel like winning. Marin set her pen down. What did it feel like? He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Like something had broken. Inside the wolf. Inside me. He flexed his hand against his knee, watching his own fingers like they belonged to someone else. We were one thing before the war. The man and the wolf. Aligned. After. He trailed off. After they started pulling apart, Marin finished. He looked at her. Yes. She held his gaze. Is that why you run at night? To burn it off? To keep the wolf from taking over? Surprise flickered across his face. How long have you known? Since the second night. You redirect the patrols. You come back with dirt on your boots and blood under your nails. And you are always calmer the morning after, like the pressure has been released. She paused. But it is not working as well as it used to. Is it? Something in his expression cracked open, just for a moment. Then it closed again. No, he admitted. It is not. The episodes continued. Marin learned to read the signs, the restlessness that crept in around midnight, the way his handwriting would change, growing sharper and more angular as the wolf pressed closer to the surface, the tension that coiled through his shoulders until every line of his body hummed with it. And every time, she did the same thing. She crossed the room. She took his hand. She talked. She told him about the archives, about the time she had discovered an entire shelf of misfiled court records that proved a minor noble house had been underpaying their taxes for 40 years. About the winter she had found a family of mice living inside a hollowed-out volume of maritime law and had secretly fed them until spring. About the old archivist, Master Aldrich, who had given her a home and a purpose when no one else had even given her a second glance. He found me hiding in the stacks when I was 8, she told Theron one night while his fingers slowly unclenched around hers and the wildness faded from his eyes. I had run away from the orphanage again. He did not ask why. He just handed me a damaged manuscript and told me to copy the legible portions. And you stayed. I stayed. He was the first person who ever made me feel like I was worth something. She paused. Like I was not just taking up space that belonged to someone else. The words came out quieter than she intended. She had not meant to say that last part, but the late hour and the firelight and the weight of his hand in hers had loosened something she usually kept sealed. Theron's grip tightened around her fingers. Not the desperate, crushing grip of the wolf. Something gentler, deliberate. You are not taking up space, he said. Marin blinked, startled by the fierceness in his voice. She looked down at their joined hands to avoid meeting his eyes because she was afraid of what he might see in hers. The arrangement shifted again, and this time neither of them acknowledged it openly. Her blanket migrated from the armchair to a narrow pallet that appeared one morning at the foot of his bed. She did not ask where it came from. A set of her quills and a pot of her preferred ink materialized on the small table by the fire. She did not ask about those either. One night she woke from a fitful sleep on the pallet to find him kneeling beside her. Marin. His voice was strangled. It is happening. She sat up immediately. In the dim glow of the dying fire she could see the tremors running through him, the veins standing out on his forearms, the way his eyes flickered between gray and black. She reached for his hand. He took it, his fingers closing around hers with bruising force. She started talking. The heroic treaty, the monastery archive, the monks and their placemat, the same stories that had worked before, delivered in the same steady voice. But this time, the words did not reach him. His grip tightened until her knuckles ground together. His breathing did not slow. The flickering in his eyes accelerated, gray giving way to black for longer and longer stretches, and she watched with growing horror as the technique that had saved him twice before failed completely. Theron, stay with me. Her voice cracked. Please. A snarl tore from his throat. His body convulsed, and for one terrible moment she thought she had lost him entirely. So she stopped talking and did something she had not planned. She let go of his hand, reached up, and pressed both palms against his face. She held him there, her thumbs against his cheekbones, her fingers in his hair, and she did not speak. She just held him, close and steady and certain. The snarl died. His breathing hitched. The black in his eyes wavered, flickered, and then his gaze focused on her face with a desperate, drowning clarity. She ran her fingers through his hair. Slow, deliberate. The tremors running through his body began to ease, not because of words this time, but because of the contact itself. Her hands in his hair, her warmth against his skin. The simple, wordless truth of her presence. He collapsed forward with his forehead against her knee, and a sound escaped him that was closer to a sob than anything else. "Do not stop," he murmured, his voice wrecked. "Please." So she did not stop. She sat on the narrow pallet in the king's chambers and stroked his hair while his breathing evened out and his body went heavy with exhaustion. When his eyes finally drifted closed, she kept her hand moving, slow and rhythmic, afraid that stopping would bring the wolf back. She sat like that until dawn. Her arm ached. Her back was stiff. She did not care about any of it because the king was sleeping, truly sleeping, with his head in her lap and his hand wrapped loosely around her ankle, and something in her chest had cracked wide open in a way she was never going to be able to fix. In the morning, she slipped out before Theron woke and went looking for Petra. She found the healer in the infirmary, cataloging dried root bundles with the methodical focus of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Petra looked up when Marin walked in, took one glance at the dark circles beneath her eyes, and set down her work. "Sit," Petra said. Marin sat. "His vitals," she started. "Is the wolf calmer? Has the severing slowed?" Petra's eyebrows rose. "You have been paying close attention. I have been sleeping on a pallet in his chambers for weeks. It is difficult not to pay attention." Marin twisted her hands in her lap. "Is it working? Am I actually helping?" Petra was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. "You are the only thing that is working. His wolf is calmer than it has been in months. The severing has not progressed since you started staying through the night." She paused. "But that is not what you came here to ask me, is it?" Marin swallowed. "Something is happening to me. The migraines when I spend even a day away from him. My wolf stirring for the first time in my life, the way I cannot breathe properly unless I am near him." She forced herself to meet Petra's gaze. "What is wrong with me?" Petra studied her the way she studied wounds, clinically and without sentimentality. "Nothing is wrong with you, child. What you are describing is a bond forming between you and the king. And bonds of this nature, once they take root, do not let go." The word landed in Marin's chest like a stone. "That is not possible," she said. "I am nobody. Bonds like that do not form with people like me." Petra's expression softened. "That is not how bonds work. They do not check your rank or your bloodline. They find the person who fits, and they hold on." She leaned forward. "But you should understand what this means. If you are separated from him for any extended period, the severing will accelerate rapidly. He is becoming dependent on you. And given what I am observing, the dependency runs in both directions." Marin stared at her, the word bond reverberating through her like a struck bell. From somewhere in the upper corridors, she heard footsteps. Then Soren's voice, muffled through stone, calling her name on the king's behalf. She turned and walked away before anyone could see her hands shaking. It happened on a Tuesday. Marin would remember that later, the useless specificity of it, because the mind clings to small details when the larger ones are too painful to hold. She had fallen asleep on the pallet again. The fire had burned low. Theron was at his desk, or had been when she closed her eyes. But sometime in the deep hours of the night, the wolf had come. She did not wake to the sound of it this time. She woke to the feeling of it. A pressure in her chest, heavy and suffocating, like a hand pressing down on her lungs. And beneath it, a rage that was not hers. A howling, tearing fury that flooded through the bond like poison through a cracked vessel, and Marin gasped awake with a scream locked behind her teeth. Theron was standing over her. Not standing. Looming. His body was rigid, every muscle locked, his hands curled into fists at his sides. His eyes were black, completely, utterly black, with no trace of the gray she knew. And he was looking at her with an expression that was not recognition. It was assessment. The cold, predatory calculation of a wolf evaluating whether something was prey. "Theron," she whispered. He did not respond. His head tilted slightly, an animal gesture, and a low sound built in his chest. Not the strained, fighting growl she had heard before. Something deeper. Something that had stopped fighting. Marin's blood went cold. She reached for his hand. He moved so fast she did not see it. One moment she was reaching for him, and the next his hand was around her wrist, pinning it to the pallet with a force that sent pain shooting up her arm. His face was inches from hers. His breath was hot against her skin. "Theron, come back," Marin said, forcing her voice steady even as her heart slammed against her ribs. "Listen to my voice. Come back to me." A spark of recognition fought through the black of his eyes. A tremor ran through his hand, through his entire body, and then the grip on her wrist loosened. His eyes flickered, black to gray to black to gray. A terrible stuttering war. And then the gray held. He looked down at his hand around her wrist, at the red marks his fingers had left on her skin. The sound he made was not human. It was anguish, raw and broken and devastating. He released her like she was made of fire and staggered backward, crashing into the desk. His hands came up to grip his own skull, fingers digging into his hair, and the sound kept coming, a low, wretched groan that seemed to pour out of somewhere deeper than his throat. "Theron, it is all right." Marin sat up, cradling her wrist. "You stopped. You came back. I could have killed you." His voice was destroyed. He would not look at her. "I was standing over you, and I did not know who you were. I did not know what you were. All I knew was that something was there, and the wolf wanted—" He could not finish. "But you did not." Marin rose from the pallet, moving toward him. "You heard me, and you stopped. This time." He finally looked at her, and the desolation in his face stole the breath from her lungs. "What about next time? What about the time my voice is not loud enough to bring me back? We will find a way." "No." The word came out hard and final. "This is over. The arrangement, your presence in these rooms, all of it. You are done here." Marin stared at him. "You cannot be serious. I am ordering you to return to your quarters and not come back. Soren will make the necessary adjustments. The court can believe whatever it wishes. I do not care." "And what about you?" Marin's voice cracked. "Who pulls you back when I am not here? That is not your problem. It has been my problem every night for weeks. And it should never have been." He turned away from her, bracing his hands on the windowsill. "Go, Marin." The use of her name, not Miss Lockwood, not a title, just her name spoken in that broken voice, was what undid her. She grabbed her blanket and her ledger and walked to the door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She stopped with her hand on the handle. "You are making a mistake," she said softly. He did not answer. She left. The corridor was dark and cold and empty, and Marin pressed her back against the wall and slid down until she was sitting on the stone floor with her arms wrapped around her knees. The wrist he had grabbed throbbed in time with her pulse. She did not cry. She sat in the dark and breathed and told herself that this was not the end, that she would find another way. But the hollow ache in her chest told her something different. It told her that the bond Petra had warned about was already deeper than she had admitted, and being cut off from him felt less like losing an arrangement and more like losing a limb. 5 days without him. Marin returned to the archives and tried to pretend that nothing had changed. She cataloged. She filed. She repaired damaged bindings with steady hands and a face that gave nothing away. She was good at this. She had spent her entire life perfecting the art of being fine, of taking up no space, of swallowing whatever was breaking inside her and carrying on. But her body betrayed her. The headache started on the second day. Dull at first, then sharp, then blinding. By the third day, she was working with the curtains drawn because the light felt like needles behind her eyes. Her wolf, that quiet, dormant creature that had never given her trouble, was suddenly restless, pacing inside her like a caged thing, pressing against her skin, whining for something Marin refused to name. She could not eat. Food turned to ash in her mouth. She could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the phantom weight of his head on her shoulder, the ghost of his hand around hers. And the absence was so acute it felt like a wound. She caught glimpses of him across the courtyard once, his tall frame unmistakable even at a distance. She stopped walking, her whole body oriented toward him like a compass finding north. He did not look at her. He turned and walked the other direction, and the longing hit her so hard she had to brace herself against the nearest pillar to stay upright. Rumors filtered down to the archives. The king was in a foul temper. He had dismissed 2 advisors from a council meeting for speaking too slowly. He had nearly overturned the war table during a strategy briefing. Soren was running interference around the clock, but even the beta was struggling to contain it. And Lord Haldrick was circling. Marin heard it from one of the kitchen staff who brought tea to the archives each morning. Haldrick had been asking questions about the king's erratic behavior, about the sudden end of his liaison with the archivist, about the scratches on his hands that no one could explain. "He smells blood in the water," the kitchen woman said, setting down the tray. "Everyone can see the king is unraveling. Haldrick is just the first one bold enough to say it out loud." Marin's stomach churned. She thanked the woman and closed the door and stood in the silent archives with her hands pressed flat on her desk, trying to breathe through the fear that was clawing up her throat. If Haldrick discovered the truth, Theron would be challenged, and Petra had said he might not survive it. On the 5th day, Marin was summoned to the council wing. A water-damaged ledger had been discovered in the lower vaults, and a counselor needed her to verify its contents before an afternoon session. A routine task. She gathered her tools and made her way through the palace corridors, focusing on each step, willing her body to cooperate despite the headache that pulsed behind her eyes like a second heartbeat. She reached the council chamber doors and paused. Voices inside. The low murmur of advisors, the scratch of quills, and beneath it all, a voice that made her heart lurch with desperate, involuntary relief. Theron was inside. Marin took a breath and pushed through the door. The chamber was full. Counselors lined the long table, maps and documents spread before them. Soren stood near the window. And at the head of the table, surrounded by the machinery of governance, sat the king. He looked terrible. The shadows under his eyes were deeper than she had ever seen them. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and even sitting still, there was a tension in him that vibrated like a plucked wire. He was holding himself together through sheer force of will, and anyone looking closely enough could see the cracks. Marin crossed toward the counselor who had requested her, keeping her head down. She was acutely aware of Theron to her left. Every step closer to him loosened the tightness behind her ribs, and every step past him wound it back twice as hard. She set her tools on the table. Her hands trembled. She could feel him across the room the way you feel a fire, the warmth reaching for her even through the distance he had forced between them. She opened the damaged ledger and tried to focus on the water-stained text. The letters swam. The headache spiked, white-hot, and the edges of her vision went gray. No, she thought. Not here, not now. The room tilted. The gray crept inward. She heard the ledger hit the table as her fingers lost their grip. She heard her name. Marin. Sharp and raw and stripped of every pretense, in a voice that crossed the room like a physical thing. Then she was falling, and the world went dark, and strong arms caught her before she reached the ground. She felt herself pulled against a solid chest, felt hands cradling her head with a tenderness that contradicted everything he had said 5 days ago. Felt the frantic hammer of a heartbeat beneath her ear that matched the desperate rhythm of her own. The last thing she registered before consciousness slipped away entirely was the sound of Theron growling, not at her, at every person in the room who took a step toward them. She woke in the infirmary. The ceiling was familiar, pale stone and dark wooden beams, and the smell of dried herbs wrapped around her like an old blanket. She turned her head and found Petra sitting beside her bed, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "How long?" Marin asked, her voice rough. 3 hours. The king carried you here himself, and refused to leave until Soren physically removed him. He is currently terrorizing everyone in the East Wing. Marin closed her eyes. He was not supposed to care. Well, Petra said dryly, he failed at that spectacularly. The entire council watched their king abandon a briefing to catch a fainting archivist. Lord Haldrick's face was something I will treasure for years. Marin would have laughed if everything did not hurt so much. Petra leaned forward, her expression shifting to something more serious. I told you the bond runs in both directions. Did you believe me? I did not want to. And now? Marin stared at the ceiling. Now I believe you. Petra nodded slowly. Good. Because what I am about to tell you is not going to be easy to hear. She paused, gathering her words with the precision of someone who had delivered hard truths many times before. The separation is accelerating his condition. Soren reports 2 episodes in the last 3 nights, both worse than anything before you arrived. His wolf is destabilizing rapidly. Marin's chest tightened. And you, Petra continued, are deteriorating in parallel. The headaches, the nausea, the inability to eat or sleep. This is not heartbreak, Marin. This is a bond being torn apart before it has finished forming, and if it continues, it will damage you both permanently. How permanently? Marin whispered. Petra held her gaze. He will go feral. Weeks, not months. And you will continue to decline until your body simply cannot sustain the strain. The words landed like stones dropping into still water. He sent me away to protect me, Marin said. I know, and it is the most destructive thing he could have done. Petra reached out and took Marin's hand. You have a choice, child. You can leave the palace. Put enough distance between you and the king that the bond weakens before it fully sets. It will hurt. It will hurt for a long time, but you will survive. And him? Petra's silence was answer enough. Or? Marin prompted. Or you go back. You fight for the bond. You accept what it means and what it will cost. And you anchor him before the wolf takes him completely. Petra squeezed her hand. But if you go back, you need to understand something. You have spent your whole life believing you are not enough, that you are not worth choosing, that you are the kind of person things happen to, not the kind of person who makes things happen. Marin's throat closed. That belief will kill you both, Petra said quietly, because he is not going to let you help him unless you fight for it. And you are not going to fight for it unless you believe you are worth fighting for. Marin lay in the infirmary bed and stared at the ceiling until the tears stopped. Then she sat up, wiped her face, and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Where is Soren? She asked. She found the beta in his office, a narrow room lined with maps and patrol rosters. He looked up when she entered, and his posture changed. The rigid wariness gave way to what looked almost like relief. I need to see him, Marin said. Soren leaned back in his chair. He has forbidden it. I know. He has specifically instructed me to keep you away from his chambers. I know that too. Soren studied her for a long moment. You collapsed in the council chamber today. I am aware, I was there. His mouth twitched. You know what is happening between you and the king. Petra explained it. The bond? The consequences of separation. Marin held his gaze. I also know that if I do not go back, he will go feral. And then you will lose him. The words hung in the air. Soren's expression did not change, but she saw his hand tighten on the arm of his chair. He will be angry, Soren said. Good. Angry means alive. Soren looked at her for another long, waited moment. Then he stood and pulled a key from his belt. I will have the eastern corridor cleared. You will have 10 minutes before the guard rotation returns. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. His voice was quiet. He is worse than you have seen him. Much worse. Marin took the key and walked through the dark corridors alone. The palace was quiet, most of the household asleep. Her footsteps echoed off stone walls, and with every step closer to his chambers, the tightness in her body unwound with every step. Like warmth returning to frozen hands. Like coming home. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was dark. The fire had not been lit. The curtains were drawn, and the only light came from a thin sliver of moonlight through a gap in the fabric. She could smell him immediately, the deep wood smoke warmth of him filling her lungs with every breath, and the relief was so profound it nearly buckled her knees. Soren. Theron's voice came from somewhere in the dark, low and rough and dangerous. I told you I did not want to be disturbed. It is not Soren, Marin said. Silence. She heard him move, a sharp intake of breath, the creak of a chair, footsteps crossing the room and then stopping. She felt him in the darkness, close, the heat of him reaching her skin before his hand did. You should not be here, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. I know. She stepped closer. And yet. Marin. Her name was a warning and a plea wrapped together. I nearly hurt you. I had my hand around your wrist and I did not know who you were. I cannot. You stopped. I might not stop next time. Then we will deal with next time when it comes. You do not understand. She could hear the anguish in his voice, ragged and barely controlled. Being near you makes it worse. The wolf recognizes you, it wants you. And the harder it pulls toward you, the harder I have to fight it. And I am losing, Marin. I am losing this fight. You are losing it faster without me, she said. Petra told me everything. 2 episodes in 3 nights. You are falling apart. He was quiet for a long, terrible moment. 5 days, Marin continued, moving closer still. 5 days without you, and I could not eat, could not sleep, could not stand upright by the end of it. I collapsed in front of your entire council, in front of Haldrick. I know, he said roughly. I caught you. Then you know this is not working. Pushing me away is not protecting me. It is killing us both. She reached for him in the dark, her fingers finding his chest, the rapid thunder of his heartbeat beneath her palm. He shuddered at the contact. I can feel the bond, she said softly. I have felt it for weeks. At first, I thought it was the arrangement, the proximity, the late nights. But it is not. It is you. And it is me. And it is not going away. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it harder against his chest. The war in him was palpable, the desperation to pull her closer, battling the terror of what might happen if he did. You deserve better than this, he said, his voice barely audible. Better than a king who cannot control his own wolf. Better than being shackled to a man who might lose himself entirely. I deserve to make my own choice, Marin replied. And I choose this. I choose you. You do not know what you are choosing. I know exactly what I am choosing. I am choosing the man who leaves a candle burning for me, who remembers every story I tell him, who carried me to the infirmary and growled at anyone who came near. Her voice shook. I am choosing the man who pushed me away because he was more afraid of hurting me than of dying alone. Marin. Her name was a groan, agonized and longing, and she felt his forehead drop against hers. If you want me to leave, she whispered, then make me leave. But know that I will come back. Every time. I will keep coming back. He was shaking. The fine tremors ran through every point of contact between them, the unmistakable surrender of a man whose walls had finally crumbled. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was desperate and fierce and tasted like salt, and she realized he was crying. She kissed him back with everything she had, pouring weeks of longing and fear and stubborn, defiant love into it. And his arms came around her and crushed her against him like he was trying to make up for every moment of distance in a single embrace. Stay, he said against her mouth. Gods help me, stay. I am not going anywhere. He pulled her closer, pressing his forehead against hers, and for a long moment they simply breathed together. Then he tilted her chin up and kissed her again. Slow and deliberate, and full of a tenderness that undid her completely. What followed was quiet and unhurried. Two people who had been circling each other for weeks, finally surrendering to the truth of what they were. He held her like she was precious. She held him like he was hers. And somewhere in the stillness between one heartbeat and the next, he pressed his mouth against the curve of her neck and marked her. The mating bite, instinctive and claiming, and the bond snapped into place like a key turning in a lock. Marin felt it bloom in her chest, warm and golden and impossibly right, connecting her to him in a way that went beyond words. She pressed her lips to his shoulder and marked him in return, and felt the bond flare and hold, complete, sealed. They lay together in the dark afterward, his arms wrapped around her head on his chest, neither of them willing to let go. I should have told you sooner, he murmured against her hair. About the bond. About what you are to me. I have known for weeks. How long exactly? She asked. Since the night you talked me back from the wolf with a story about wine stains on a treaty. He pressed his lips to her temple. You were sitting on the floor holding my hand, and I knew. I knew. And I was terrified because you were not supposed to be mine. You were supposed to be safe. Safe is overrated, Marin said. He laughed, low and quiet, and the sound rumbled through his chest against her ear. She closed her eyes and let herself sink into the warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart, the hum of the bond between them. She felt him surrender to sleep. His body went heavy and relaxed beneath her, his breathing slowing into something deep and peaceful and utterly untroubled. No tension, no fight, no wolf clawing at the edges. Joy swelled in her chest until she thought it might crack her open. She had done this. She had given him this. Marin closed her eyes and let sleep pull her under. She woke in a forest that was not a forest. The trees were wrong, too tall, too twisted, their bark black and slick like wet stone. The ground beneath her bare feet was soft in a way that felt intentional, yielding, as though something beneath the surface was breathing. The air smelled of iron and ash and something older, something patient. And everywhere she looked, there were wolves. The wolves were everywhere. They moved through the black trees like smoke, dozens of them, their fur matted and dark, their eyes reflecting nothing. They circled without sound, without breath, without the warmth that should have radiated from living bodies. These were not alive. Marin understood that immediately. These were memories, given teeth. She walked forward on bare feet, the soft, breathing ground yielding beneath each step. The iron smell was stronger here, and the deeper she went into the trees, the more the air pressed against her. Heavy. Wrong. Watching. Theron, she called. Her voice was swallowed instantly, eaten by the silence before it could reach the canopy. The bond hummed in her chest, faint but present, pulling her forward like a thread stitched through her ribs. She followed it. The trees thinned into a clearing, and she found him. Theron was on his knees. His head was bowed, his hands flat against the dark ground, and he was utterly still. Around him, the wolves had gathered in a wide, silent ring. They did not snarl, they did not attack. They simply watched with those empty, lightless eyes, and the weight of their collective gaze was unbearable. Marin rushed forward and dropped to her knees beside him. "Theron, look at me." He did not move. She could feel him through the bond, and what she felt nearly dragged her under. Guilt so vast it had no edges. Grief so deep it had become geography, had become this place. And beneath it all, a terrible, quiet agreement. An acceptance that he deserved this. "They were mine," he said, his voice hollow. "Every one of them." Marin looked at the wolves surrounding them. She looked more carefully this time, and understanding settled over her like cold water. These were not just wolves. These were his wolves. Pack members. Soldiers who had followed him into the mountain war in their shifted forms. Wolves who had fought beside him and died beside him and never come home. "The war," she whispered. "I ordered them forward." His voice was barely audible. "The final assault on the eastern ridge, I knew the cost. I calculated the losses and decided they were acceptable." His hands curled into the soft ground, fingers sinking in. "Acceptable. I use that word. I stood in my command tent and I called their deaths acceptable." One wolf stepped forward from the ring, larger than the rest, with a scar running across its muzzle. It stopped directly in front of Theron and stared at him with those empty eyes. "Brennan," Theron said, and the name cracked in half. "My second, my friend. He took the ridge because I asked him to. He died on it because I sent him there." The wolf that had been Brennan opened its mouth, and the voice that came out was not a wolf's voice. It was Theron's own, distorted and echoing, turned back against him like a blade. "You knew what would happen. You sent them anyway. A better alpha would have found another way." Marin's breath caught. This was the same mechanism. Not the ghost's words. His words. The guilt had built itself a courtroom and appointed him as both the accused and the judge, and every night it delivered the same verdict. "Theron." She gripped his arm. "This is not real. These are not their voices. This is your guilt wearing their faces." "Does that make it less true?" he asked. "Yes." Marin moved in front of him, forcing him to see her. "Because guilt is not truth. Guilt is a wound that keeps reopening because you will not let it close." She held his face between her hands. "You went to war because the alternative was worse. You made impossible decisions because no one else could make them. People died, and that is devastating, and you are allowed to grieve that for the rest of your life. But you are not allowed to let it eat you alive." The wolves pressed closer, their empty eyes bored into her. The not Brennan wolf spoke again in Theron's stolen voice. "You cannot save him. He does not want to be saved." Marin looked at the wolf steadily. "I did not ask what he wants. I am telling you what he deserves." She turned back to Theron. His eyes were raw, stripped bare, and through the bond, she sensed him teetering on the edge between surrender and resistance. "I know what it feels like to believe you are not worth saving," Marin said, her voice thick. "I spent 20 years believing I was not worth keeping, that my parents left me on those steps because something in me was lacking, that every good thing I was given was borrowed and could be taken back at any moment." His eyes focused on her, really focused, for the first time since she had found him in this terrible place. "But I was wrong," she continued, tears running down her face. "And so are you. You are not the sum of the lives you could not save. You are also the lives you did save, the kingdom you held together. The people who followed you because they believed in you. not because you were perfect, but because you were theirs. She pressed her forehead against his. And you are mine, and I am not leaving you here. The clearing was silent. Then Theron's hands came up and covered hers where they rested against his face. His fingers shook. I am sorry, he said to the wolves surrounding them. His voice broke, but he did not look away from Marin's eyes. I am sorry I could not bring you home. I am sorry that my best was not enough, but I cannot stay here anymore. The wolf that wore Brennan's shape looked at him for a long, still moment. Then it closed its eyes and began to dissolve. Not violently, gently, like mist burning off in morning light. One by one, the other wolves followed, their shapes softening, thinning, fading into the air until the clearing was empty. The black trees began to pale. The iron smell lifted. The breathing ground went still beneath their knees. Theron collapsed forward into Marin's arms. She caught him, held him, wrapped herself around him as tightly as she could, while the forest dissolved around them and the darkness gave way to something warmer. I have you, she whispered into his hair. I have you. Marin woke in his bed, in his arms, in the warm amber light of early morning. Theron was already awake, looking down at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and wet, but clear. Human. His. He cupped her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that made her chest ache. You came in after me, he said. Of course I did. You fought my ghosts with a speech about borrowed things and wine-stained treaties. It worked, did it not? He laughed. It was a broken, beautiful sound, and it shook loose something that had been locked tight in both of them for a very long time. He pulled her against his chest and held her so close she could feel his heartbeat against her own. Thank you, he whispered. Marin tilted her head up to look at him. Do not thank me. Just stay. His arms tightened around her. I am not going anywhere. She smiled against his chest. For the first time since she had stumbled into that corridor at dawn, clutching land treaties and covered in ink, the future did not feel like something to survive. It felt like something to look forward to. The wolf did not quiet all at once. Theron still had episodes. The fracture between man and wolf did not heal overnight, and there were nights when Marin sat with him on the floor of their chambers and held his hand while the shaking passed. But each time, she pulled him back. Each time, the wolf retreated faster and fought less. Petra monitored his progress with her usual brisk efficiency and a barely concealed smile. The bond is stabilizing both sides, she told Marin privately after a month. The severing is reversing. Slowly, but it is reversing. Their mating sent shockwaves through the court. A foundling archivist as the Alpha King's bonded mate was not what anyone had anticipated. Lord Haldrick, who had spent months constructing a narrative of the king's instability, found his careful work dismantled by the simple, infuriating fact that the king had never looked stronger or more at peace. The whispers followed Marin everywhere. She felt the weight of every sidelong glance, every murmured judgment, every raised eyebrow when she walked the corridors that had once been above her station. But Theron's hand was steady in hers, and his voice was sure when he addressed the court with her beside him. They will adjust, he told her one evening in the quiet of their chambers, and those who do not can take the matter up with their king, who happens to be unreasonably devoted to his mate. Unreasonably, Marin repeated, smiling. Thoroughly and irrevocably unreasonably, he confirmed. Months later, Marin woke to pale light filtering through the curtains. Theron was still asleep beside her, his face peaceful, his breathing deep and even. One arm was draped across her waist, anchoring her against him even in sleep. No shaking, no wolf pressing at the edges, no twisted forest waiting to pull him under. She watched him for a moment, warmth blooming in her chest. Then she settled back against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and they slept.